Question states, cystic fibrosis is a recessive disease in humans. Based on the principles of classical Mendelian genetics, what is the probability that a child will be born with the disease if one parent is a carrier of the trait and the other parent is homozygous dominant? So we're told here that cystic fibrosis is a recessive disease. What do we mean by a recessive disease? In a recessive disease, an individual must receive both copies of a recessive allele in order to be affected by the trait. What do we mean by recessive alleles? When you look at the traits or the phenotypes, in other words, what you observe in a person or an individual, any organism, not only people, you see certain traits. For instance, the hair color, the height, the skin color or complexion, those kind of features. So these features are called traits and they appear in dominant and recessive forms. So if you see one trait more commonly in the population than the other, we say that's the dominant trait. For instance, in humans, you notice that there are more people on Earth with brown hair than there are people with blonde hair. Similarly, there are more people with brown eyes than there are people with blue eyes. So we say that brown hair is dominant to blonde hair, or that brown eyes is dominant to blue eyes. We would say that recessive alleles create blue eyes and that recessive alleles create blonde hair, while dominant alleles create brown hair and dominant alleles create brown eyes. So that's what dominant and recessive means. So cystic fibrosis is defined here as a recessive disease, which means the individual must receive two identical copies of the recessive allele in order for the disease to be present in the individual. Now, before we can assess the percentage of the offspring between the parents, we need to look at the parents' genotypes. We notice that one parent is homozygous dominant. This means the parent carries two copies of the dominant allele for cystic fibrosis, while the other parent, we're told, is a carrier. A carrier is a person who is heterozygous for the condition, meaning he or she carries one copy of the dominant allele and one copy of the recessive allele. So to analyze this question, we can take a look at the Punnett square for cystic fibrosis under these conditions. So here in the Punnett square, we see that we have two parents. We can say the parent at the top is the father and the one on the left here is the mother. Notice that the father has two dominant alleles. Remember, he was homozygous dominant. And by dominant, we represent this with a large letter, or we would say a capital letter. Now, because I'm talking about cystic fibrosis, I chose to use C's. The letter is arbitrary, it doesn't matter. If I was discussing hemophilia, I could use H. If I was discussing hair color, I could use B for brown, and so on and so forth. So this is the father's genotype. This is the mother's genotype. Now let's predict the offspring's genotype. So in the Punnett square, we simply multiply or bring across and bring down each of the alleles. Notice here the mother, she has a dominant copy of the allele, so we bring it across here. The father also has a dominant copy, so we bring it, and the offspring in this instance, in this square, would be homozygous dominant, homozygous, two of the same dominant alleles for the trait. This individual would not have cystic fibrosis. Notice it's the same thing for this individual or organism here as well. Down here, we would bring down the father's dominant allele and bring across the mother's recessive allele. So the recessive alleles are always represented with lowercase letters. Notice here that this individual is heterozygous for the trait the same way the mother was, and the same is true for this individual. So we have a 2 out of 4 chance, right? 1, 2 out of a total of 4, or 50% chance that the offspring will have homozygous dominant alleles. So here, these individuals are like the father. They are not affected, but they're homozygous dominant. Down here, these individuals are like the mother. They're unaffected by the trait, but they're also carriers. So based on this Punnett square, the correct response to our question is A, 0%, because none of the organisms or none of the offspring will be affected by the trait. So remember, in cystic fibrosis or any other recessive Mendelian diseases in which one gene controls one trait, that's what a Mendelian disease is, you have to have both parents with recessive alleles. Since only one parent had a recessive allele, it was impossible for the offspring to be born with the trait. So if both were carriers, there would have been a 25% probability that the child would have been born with cystic fibrosis. However, because one parent was homozygous dominant, which we said was the father, he had no recessive alleles to donate, and this is why the correct response to the question is A, 0%.